Hi everybody and welcome back to Ethics and Archaeology. Today we're going to be talking about colonialism, colonization, and the legacy that has for archaeology. This is probably going to be one of the harder topics that we talk about in our course. So if you don't feel like this is something that you have the energy or the emotional availability to really connect with, I totally understand. Feel free to skip this week, or just maybe do the readings if you can. I truly don't feel like I could ever sum up everything that needs to be said about colonialism and archaeology in one lecture, no matter how long it would be. So I hope you understand that this is just a very brief overview to kind of give you the tools to be able to read more about this in future. I'll also point out that I know that it's hugely ironic that I, as a white Australian, am going to be talking about this, but I hope you understand that if I could have found, a different presentation that I felt covered everything that I wanted to talk about, I would have linked that for you, so I didn't have to talk about this. But I think this is a very important conversation to be having. And to really recognize the difficulties surrounding. It's definitely an ethical debate, a number of ethical debates rolled into one, so let's get into it. Firstly, we obviously need to go through some definitions. There's going to be a fair few definitions this time around, just to kind of make sure we're on the same page. We're then going to talk about the history of archaeology's role in terms of colonization and colonialism. We're then going to talk about the current impacts of colonization, post-colonialism, decolonization, everything, or at least try to cover, some of the breadth of everything for archaeology today, because it's certainly not something that is done and past and doesn't need to be talked about anymore. And then we're going to talk about Australian heritage, because I think it's good to kind of center all of these broader discussions in a real case study. So I'm going to be talking about my experience with my own country's heritage laws. Some of you also flagged that you wanted to kind of hear about what the ethical situations in terms of archaeology are like in Australia. So that's what we're going to do. And then we are also going to talk about the number of ongoing questions to do with this. Again, not going to be able to cover all of them, but just, give you a little taste and start to get the ball rolling so that in future you can continue to engage with these kind of topics. So, colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. So this is essentially the theory which lends itself to government policy and discourse and particular beliefs around occupation of territory. That's colonialism. On the other hand, we have colonization, which they do sound very similar because they're quite related. Colonization is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous population of an area. So this is the act which is justified by colonialism, the theory, which lends itself to the movement of people, the dispossession of land from indigenous peoples, and the atrocities which were committed in every which way against indigenous peoples. The second set of definitions that we need to go over is the couple of differences in different types of colonization and colonialism. This is really just the bare bones, as you can understand. But firstly, we have settler colonialism, which is the absorption of an area into an empire and the implantation of a settler population who are normally already kind of part of the empire. So, for example, Australia as a penal and settled colony of Britain. We were British citizens that were transplanted onto here. Contrary to that is exploitative colonialism. This isn't to say that settler colonialism isn't exploitative, but exploitative colonialism aims first and foremost to make profit of taking the natural resources and labour from a given population rather than trying to interpolate them into the population. So, for example, this one example of that is the Belgian exploitation of the Congo. So forced labour, stripping of natural resources, extortion, the list goes on. As I flagged earlier, colonialism is far from over, and one way that we can talk about it in closer to the present day is through the lens of neo-colonialism, which is the continued economic and cultural control of countries that have been decolonized. So this happens even until today, but the example that I wanted to just flag for you guys is France-Afrique, which was the continued economic and, to a degree, social kind of control that France had over its countries that were once part of its empire, so namely Western African countries. Especially during the Cold War, they bound the economies of a number of nations in West Africa to the franc, which was the method of currency before the euro, to basically keep them tied together economically and codependent in a way. This was especially prevalent not just with France, but with a number of different, former empire hubs, centres, cores, if you will, during the Cold War in order to keep the former colonies from becoming communist. So, how does this all link to archaeology? That's a good question, and a very, very difficult one to answer. So we've covered the notion of the Grand Tour, the Cabinet of Curiosities, and early scientific archaeology a couple of times already, so I'm not going to go into that. But essentially, the way that these things were pursued was through the access and privilege that having, more wealth, which was acquired through slavery and colonization, gave to a number of Western powers. They wouldn't have been able to do this stuff if they didn't have an exorbitant amount of wealth, which came through stripping that from other people. So, I start there. Another thing that archaeology had a big role to do with is this development of scientific racism. It's not actually scientific, it's a huge pseudoscience which has been disproven a number of times. But one particular way that it can be connected to archaeology is through the link with the Caucasian origin myth. So essentially what happened was that certain skulls were discovered or excavated from mountain caves in the Caucasus, specifically Georgia. These skulls were, taken by Western naturalists, people who thought they knew what they were doing in terms of science, and these skulls were used to create what was known then as a racial hierarchy. So Blumenbach is one example, a German naturalist who created this theory of having 5 human races with the Caucasian at the top. And it was theorized that the Caucasian was, that Adam and Eve were from the Caucasus, and then they birthed white people from that, and Europeans. So this racial science, which has links to archaeology and archaeological practice, especially in terms of like reading the Bible, reading, the Epic of Gilgamesh, using the, boat myth or the Noah's Ark kind of thing. This all ties together to essentially form a justification for racism and racially exploitative policies, essentially, which were based on this idea that there is just a natural order to things. Obviously, this is complete crap. It's been disproven so many times that, there is no genetic difference between humans in terms of, race. Sorry, this just gets my blood boiling even reading about it and talking about it. Anyway, so yeah, this is another way that archaeology has been used to justify colonialism, because there was this belief that white people were descended from a different race of people, and therefore they had, superiority over other people, and then they could use that to possess land and commit absolute atrocities. Great, awesome, let's move on. A little bit more closer to the current time, archaeology can be linked to colonialism through this control of the narrative, which explores the idea that Western archaeologists believe that the things they discover couldn't have possibly been created by the indigenous people or the people currently living in the area that they're exploring. It really serves to discredit the many amazing indigenous technologies and, a continuity of culture, which you can see the world over, from Australia to America, everywhere. There's just so much. But, this, for example, something that's, seen a lot in my country, for example, is this notion that a lot of, stone structures or particular ways of fishing couldn't have possibly been done by the indigenous people who are indigenous to Australia, but had to have been done by some other population that came in, which was probably closer to the Caucasian. Anyway, would have done this and then left. So it's just a continuous kind of it's a continuous interpretation of archaeology and archaeological material, which favours this idea that Western and white bodies and perspectives and cultures are superior. So obviously there are some clear links between that and the narratives behind colonialism. And then to this day, we also have a huge amount of whitewashing in the archaeological community. Western archaeologists being, the most hailed as the most famous and important. Oxford and Cambridge are still the most well-renowned archaeological universities, and Western archaeologists are still credited with the notoriety of finding things which Indigenous people would have known about for tens of thousands of years, would have probably made themselves. But even in terms of people who might not be as closely linked culturally to the artifacts that are found, for example, the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by Sir Leonard Woolley. Everybody remembers him, the British archaeologist, but the people who contributed massively to that, who were Egyptian, don't have nearly as much notoriety. So that's just the history. What's happening now? This is something that is far from over, and which is why I really wanted to talk about this today, because I think when we talk about the history of colonialism, it's really easy to get wrapped up in the obvious, atrocities that happened in terms of massacres and, abductions, possession of land, but this stuff is still ongoing, and especially in archaeology. So Western museums still possess a huge amount of artifacts which were stolen or taken during the colonial mission. This leads to inaccessibility for people who are probably more culturally linked to these artifacts. It also leads to a huge amount of scientific privilege. If you possess the artifacts, then you can study them and you can publish them, and you can gain this kind of notoriety that we just spoke about. Whereas the people who might view those objects differently, view them as closely linked to their own culture, don't have the access to those things, and therefore cannot build their way up in terms of this, scientific notion. And yeah, that just perpetuates this cycle of Western museums and Western people having more ability to access certain things. Also income. The British Museum makes so much money. The Pergamon makes so much money. The Louvre makes so much money. The Met, the list goes on and on. Having these artifacts that were taken, essentially stolen, still has a huge amount of capital attached to it, and that is the reason why they don't want to repatriate it, which we talked about last week. But as you can see, all of these things link up together, and that's why I've done these presentations in a particular way, is because these things keep coming back around and around, and you cannot solve one without bringing up another. You can't talk about one without talking about another. So the possession of artifacts lends itself to all of these things, but even the method of display, the museum as it stems from the Cabinet of Curiosities, and the way that it's displayed is this kind of, passive, observing, less engaging way of viewing artifacts is a very Western construct. And yeah, having this that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I was going to go on, but it doesn't matter. The method of display in Western museums just perpetuates Western views, essentially. Something that is particularly heinous that I wanted to bring up is the notion of bodies of Indigenous peoples in Western collections of museums, which came through excavation normally. Some of them do come from when Indigenous people were abducted and brought to Europe. That's a whole other thing that I don't want to get into. But the repatriation of Indigenous bodies, physical bodies which need to be on country in Australia, and buried and having this connection, I assume the same is very similar for a number of First Nations American and Canadian and South American peoples. Still a huge amount of bodies in Western collections to this date. Like the BM only repatriated some about 2 years ago. This is stuff that is still going on. And the fact that somebody would have to argue over having their ancestors' remains brought back to their country is just absolutely obscene. And just, oh my god. Anyway. The notion of what constitutes a complex society is something that comes up a lot in archaeology, and is the reason why everybody is so obsessed with Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece and Rome and, obviously a whole bunch more, but those are kind of the top tier in terms of what's discussed, not in terms of the remains or the importance. This notion of a complex society is very complex in and of itself, but it usually talks about a certain degree of political, economic, cultural production. There's a certain degree of that which is considered to make something a complex society rather than just a regular society. And this really prioritizes the ideas that came out of the Industrial Revolution and, this idea of like production and complexity in terms of like social constructs is the most important thing. And that really foregrounds a certain number of civilizations, but it also does a huge disservice to a number of indigenous civilizations, which are built more so on ideas of sustainability and, cyclical movement through time and reusing resources responsibly. These are lessons that we really need to learn now as we go through a huge amount of climate change. And potentially having to reconsider what we think is the most important in terms of what counts as a complex society is something that is hopefully going to increase in discussion. Moving on. foreground, yeah, it's kind of similar to what I mentioned earlier with Leonard Woolley. This notion that Western qualifications and interpretations of archaeological objects or sites are the most important is something that is a huge issue today, and it's actually part of what I'm writing my own thesis about, because it's ongoing until literally today, this second. I'm sure it's happening right now on an archaeological site somewhere. It really can be summed up by the idea that university and tertiary education is the most important and lends itself most to being able to interpret things most accurately, which is not always true. Indigenous perspectives and cultures are hugely important in our interpretations of things, because there is this much more entrenched understanding of what things look like, and how things were used. And also, I think I'm going to talk about it in a sec, but ethnoarchaeology is something that is hugely important, which is essentially the exploration of it's essentially talking to people who are alive today who have certain connections to the past, and they know about certain technologies which might have been forgotten and or might have not been taught in a Western institution or in a university somewhere, but it's still hugely important to our interpretations. For example, I worked in Georgia, and a number of ethnoarchaeological explorations have been done where they speak to people who have, like, in their kitchens, they have kind of like a hole in the ground, like covered kind of thing. And they're now used for keeping stuff cold and whatever, but they used to be used for a number of different things, which we can trace all the way back to, like, the Middle Ages. So essentially, this is just saying that what you learn in university is not always the be-all and end-all. There are a number of different perspectives, and having a rich diversity of understandings and of backgrounds on an archaeological site is super important for making sure that you do justice to what's there. Anyway, so on to something super fun, which I love to talk about, the failures of my own country. So just to give you some background, Australia has the oldest continuous cultures in the world. Some archaeological estimates say 40,000 years of occupation, some up to 120,000 years of occupation and continuous living off the land, understanding. There's a huge connection between Australian Indigenous cultures and the land that they're on. It's incredible to read about. If you want to read more, I would recommend Dark Emu as a book. Yeah, I wish I could talk about this all day, but we've got to move on. So, 120,000 years, or maybe a little bit less, and then the British came and instituted essentially a huge amount of violent dispossession, abduction, huge range of sexual assault, and cultural destruction in terms of language, in terms of archaeology, in terms of ways of living, and this was all based on the notion of terra nullius, which is the idea that there was nothing here, the land was empty, even though it wasn't. And then Australia, or so-called Australia, as it's currently referred to by a number of people, was put instead. But this doesn't mean that Indigenous cultures stopped. Indigenous cultures are still very much present and still extremely important to explore and talk about. They didn't end in 1779 when Australia was, stuck a flag in it. No, not at all. So, as it currently stands, there are different systems in every state and territory of this country. There are 7 states and territories. I live in Victoria, which is where Melbourne is. It's in the southeast. And essentially what we have is probably the most updated form of cultural heritage law. So what we have is this separation between Indigenous and colonial historical archaeology, which is great in theory because a lot of the other states don't have that. A lot of the other states, like New South Wales, where Sydney is, for example, um, their Indigenous heritage is mostly falls under the Forestry Act. That's a problem, in Western Australia, um, in the west, where Perth is, if you know what that is. There's a huge amount of mining happening there, which is terrible for cultural heritage. Because when you dig things up, you tend to destroy them. And recently we saw the destruction of potentially one of the most important sites in the Pilbara in the north, which happened as a result of terrible heritage laws and mining companies who wanted to make extra money. So, back to Victoria, we have the most updated and the most current, I guess, heritage legislation, but having this division between Indigenous and historical archaeology doesn't allow much for crossover between the two, and also kind of sends the message that Indigenous culture stopped as soon as colonialism started, which it absolutely didn't. So there are a number of frustrating things to do with that. In Victoria, when there is an Indigenous site or there is Indigenous material, we work in collaboration with Indigenous representatives who come from the local group. There's a number. There's a lot of them, so I'm not going to be listing them now. But we try to do it collaboratively between the reps and archaeologists to make sure that there is this appropriate amount of respect and care taken in terms of taking care of Indigenous cultural heritage. But because there is that necessity to have such collaboration, they usually tends to fall under what is called commercial archaeology. So that happens when you want to develop a piece of land into housing estate, buildings, whatever. It tends to fall under that, and that's how people get paid. That's how reps get paid. That's how archaeologists get paid. But because of this, it tends to be easier to access funding for international archaeological projects than it is for investigations of Indigenous heritage. Which is a huge problem because it doesn't foreground the Indigenous voice in a scientific and a research kind of point of view to give it the appropriate attention that it deserves. Obviously, there is a number of amazing Indigenous heritage projects happening, but it's rough out there. So, ongoing questions that we need to talk about. These are just a few of the many that need to be continually discussed. Firstly, is post-colonialism possible? Post-colonialism is the notion of moving beyond colonialism. Is this even possible in terms of the entrenched structures which still exist and the rise and continuous presence of neo-colonialism the world over? Is it possible to have post-colonialism on a dig? Or even do digs have a role in a post-colonial world as a colonial practice? Something like archaeology and anthropology, which emerge as ways for Western people to really just explore things that they found interesting in a very possessive way. Do they have a role? I just spoke about ethnoarchaeology, and there's also post-processual theory, which emerged from the 1990s. Read more about Ian Hodder if you're interested in this. But it's essentially the idea that every person on dig has a voice, no matter what their background is, no matter what their education level is. Everybody should be able to contribute their interpretation, and it's through an amalgamation of all of these different perspectives that you get something that is, rich enough or diverse enough to potentially be closest to the truth. Which is kind of what I said before, the more diverse perspectives you have, the more able you are to be able to interpret diverse things when you come across them in archaeology. Because the fact is, like in a lot of instances, not indigenous stuff, but other stuff, these cultures are gone, and we're never going to be able to fully understand them. And so it doesn't make sense to just be foregrounding like a Western, a British, an Australian perspective. Why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. So the more kind of different perspectives you have, the better it is for the interpretation. And final question that I'd like you to consider, can colonial institutions such as museums or universities, as we've explored these things, really lended themselves or even emerged from colonialism, racial science, etc.? Can they be decolonised? Can you have a decolonised space within a museum? Here in Melbourne, we have the Melbourne Museum, and there's an area called Bunjalaka, which is the Indigenous heritage sector. And we had a presentation from the curator, who's an Indigenous woman herself, and through discussions with elders and a range of First Nations people, they created the exhibition, which is now there. So is that an example of a decolonised space within a colonial institution? As usual, what you think is the most important. Thank you for bearing with me. I know this isn't a fun topic, and I know I haven't done it justice at all whatsoever, but these are just some kind of very, very bare bones things that I'd really love you guys to add some flesh to, add some really interesting insights, because I know that a fair few of you have come from countries that experienced colonialism, or maybe you didn't. It'd be really interesting to hear what you think. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you're all safe and well wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you next week. See ya.